Sea states during times of war. And this follows Edward the Confessor's decree in 1051. And by the 13th century, William of Wrotham became what's called a Custos Galliarum, or Custos Portum, which means the custodian of the ports, or custodian of the galleys. The king gathered a fleet so that the Sans-Culotte provided. However, the autonomy of the Sans-Culotte right with piracy, and this has angered many factions, such as France, the Low Countries, Holland, Zealand, has angered the Hanseatic League in Germany, and then France in the Mediterranean sector, from Philip IV the Fair, hired Genoese shipwrights to construct a shipyard along the Rhone River called Les Clos de Calais, which developed sluice gates to control water level. And this is one of the earliest shipyards in the Mediterranean. So the 12th to the 15th century, the Germans developed the cog, and this was heavily copied by other European powers used the cog. And so the first cogs did not have an aft castle, but by the 14th century, a stern castle was developed on all cogs, and it developed a stern rudder. And the development of the stern castle allowed crossbowmen a distinct advantage to fire in the enemy's weather deck. Later, they would be using guns such as the Hatboek, which is kind of looks like a bazooka. They use hand cannons, handguns against their enemy towards gunpowder was developed. And this is also a clinker-built ship. And you could imagine a canard just being evolved to be wider and taller. And that's exactly what the cog becomes. Now, earlier, a crew of the cog could be 18 to 25 men with 5 to 20 passengers, but later it could hold 100 men. For example, the Bremen cog could hold 80 tons. Its speed was 4.5 to 6.3 knots. And the cog had a keel, and most have a cog plank. And many have kind of a flat bottom, but it's not truly flat. And its strakes were held together with iron nails. And 12th through the 15th century, the hull became developed. However, archaeologists have had problems finding the hull, and many have suggested it has a reverse clinker hull. To get that in perspective, a regular clinker would have first plank would be inboard to the second plank, and the second plank would be outboard to the first plank, and the third would be outboard to the second. Supposedly for the hull that was reversed. Other Europeans were using the Hulk, and actually the Hanseatic League delayed on using the Hulk until around 1400 CE. And then there was called the Kravi, which actually looks exactly almost a adapted cog with a forecastle and aft castle or a hull, but instead it's used caravel design. And the three-masted Dasgros Kravel was fitted for war against England in 1470. So one of the battles I want to talk about is the Battle of Sluys, and then the beginning of the 100 Years' War, King Edward III and with High Admiral William B. Clinton led the English against Hugh Pierre, Admiral de France, and Nicolle Pécuchet, Grand Constable de France, basically means constable, and Genoese galley Admiral Gilles Egidio Boccanegra, and the inlet between Zealand and West Flanders. The English fleet of 120 to 150 cogs went up against the French fleet of 213 cogs and galleys. Boccanegra led a fleet of Genoese galleys. And after the day where the French were held together by chains and ropes, and they sailed against the wind against the English fleet. A bad idea, and Boccanegra refused to do so, and he did capture a couple vessels and he left because he thought the French command did not know what they were doing. And then a lot of range engagements happened between the crossbowmen and longbowmen, followed by men-at-arms boarding the enemy vessels. The vast amount of longbows outnumbered the crossbows. Only 17, that's 7 French ships, apart from the Genoese galley fleet, escaped, leaving 16,000 and 20,000 lost. This became a general scare because the English fleet would be unchallenged in the invasion of the northern French coast. So when we come towards the Renaissance and the end of the War of the Roses, a major transition that occurs. Most ships are caravel, built to increase displacement. The amount of tonnage increases dramatically. Most of these ships have cannon installed within the decking instead of simply placed along the gunnels. The Mary Rose, for instance, was constructed in 1510 and illustrates transition to the carrack and later the galleon with cannon emplacements, but were equipped for boarding by its long-range bombardment. And there's multiple ships, for instance the carrack, which had rounder and wider hulls compared to galleons, having a more chubby appearance. The English royal carracks from Henry VIII to Elizabeth I had stern castles and forecastles cut down to make them seaworthy since the sinking of the Mary Rose. They could displace 800 to 1,000 tons, yet were slower than the race-built galleon, which is an English design, and despite being more maneuverable than a Spanish galleon. Spanish galleons were very tanky. The Kromster was a Dutch mainstay ship which had an aft sail and a sprit sail, which made them small, beamy, and shallow draught, which had heavy armament, which was ideal for estuary sea beggars. More about that, the Dutch also used yachts and sprit sails towards the early parts of the 80 Years' War until around 1600 or 1590, where a lot of the Dutch were building bigger ships to combat the Spanish Navy, which was using a lot of galleons. Continuing on, so there's the pinnace, the shallop, and the hoy. These are really small, relatively small ships. These displace 20 to 60 tons and around 50 feet long, 17 feet wide, and could be powered by oar and sail, but usually used for towing larger ships. And the barks were used by the English, and these could displace about 250 tons. We kind of dance around this, but there's the caravel. That is under 100 feet long and displaced up to 200 tons. And these were the auxiliary ships to the galleon and had 3 sails. So when we talk about carracks, and this is kind of interesting because the Tudor dynasty, starting with Henry VII and later Henry VIII, invested heavily in carracks and were pioneering guns, yet we're still using boarding tactics. But really, these were smaller cannons designed to prevent boarding actions. So the Tudor dynasty with Henry VII and Henry VIII defined the naval royals carrack as a sprit sail, mainsail, foresail, and a mizzen sail. The definition of a ship was identical to a carrack, except a second mizzen mast was established on the aft castle, and so a ship basically had an extra sail that the carrack didn't have. This transition to heavy cannons happened during Henry VII. For instance, in 1485, Mary of the Tower was littered with at least 58 guns. But a lot of these were handguns and hackbutts, and I mentioned before, the little, like, big bazookas you would carry on your shoulder. Newer ships such as the Flemish Kraak was built in 1468 in Henry VII's sovereign regent in 1486-1487 at port pieces for broadside. Carville building these ships were critical to be carried and use the hand volumes to be fired up gunnels. And then we start seeing the bigger, badder ships, the Spanish galleys, which are designed to transport as much gold as they can from the Atlantic and protect themselves from boarding actions with cannons. So the Spanish really started building these in Cadiz and Seville along the Andalusian coast and the Basque coast from La Coruna to Santander, especially Bilbao, and later in 1610 in Havana, which became a shipyard. However, the coastline from Cartagena to Barcelona were designated for galley construction. For construction, the keel, or the quilla, was laid on the ground with a calculated construction zone, astillero, which is what the construction zone is. The stem, which is the rota, and the stern, castora, were added. So they are connecting the backbone to the stem and the stern. The beam, the manga, was mathematically calculated, and the ribs, cuadera, was raised to the gunnels, the chintas or quintas. They had their decks and the skin was laid out. Below the waterline, the skin of the ship had a layer of lead, then tar and animal fat for protection against tornado wounds. This was very revolutionary for its time, and the ship was guided by the helmsman on the bridge, or the puente. A tiller to the rudder through a whipstaff was a pinzote, and the rigging bulkheads and capstans were added. So one thing I want to talk about is the English changes to the galleon, and they have done what I'm talked about previously, was a race-built galleon, and the Spanish galleon could displace 1,000 tons, whereas the English race-built galleon could displace 500 tons. Compared to the English and Spanish, they were different, and compared to the Spanish, their superstructure was lower, replacing the stern castle with a sloping lower deck, or what they call a sloping quarterdeck. They had a larger hull length to beam ratio and were designed for gunnery battles by boarding. Both the English and Spanish galleons would have 3-mast, 4-mast, mainmast, and mizzenmast, and a bowsprit for propulsion. The English, Dutch, and French would use 4-wheel gun carriages for their cannons, where the Spanish would have 2-wheel gun carriages. And the English were also using cast iron instead of bronze. And the Dutch fleets in the 16th century were using yachts, galleys, and spritsails in the war against Spain. However, larger ships meant they were later developed. Against the Spanish. However, larger ships were meant for war and they were developed, such as the Margarera and Tisafone by 1598. Small yachts were used, and these were have 18 to 24 pounder